The Atlantic slave trade was a dark chapter in human history. It spanned from the late 15th century to the early 19th century. During this time, millions of Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas. They endured unimaginable suffering and hardship. The trade shaped economies, cultures, and societies on both sides of the Atlantic. It left an enduring legacy of racism and inequality. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is a story of human cruelty and resilience.
The Atlantic slave trade was fundamentally driven by economic motives. European nations sought to maximize their profits from their colonies in the New World. They needed a large, cheap labor force to work on plantations and in mines. Enslaved Africans became the solution to this labor demand. The economic benefits for European traders and American plantation owners were enormous. European traders formed tragic alliances with African leaders and traders. Local rulers captured and sold their own people or neighboring tribes to European traders. This was often done in exchange for goods such as guns, alcohol, and textiles. The trade was part of a larger system known as the triangular trade. Ships from Europe carried goods to Africa where they were exchanged for enslaved people. These enslaved individuals were then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, a journey known as the Middle Passage. Finally, goods produced in the Americas, such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, were shipped back to Europe.
The Middle Passage was one of the most horrific aspects of the Atlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were packed into ships like cargo. Conditions on these ships were appalling. Men, women, and children were chained together in cramped, filthy spaces. They had little room to move and were subjected to brutal treatment by the crew. The journey across the Atlantic could take several weeks to several months. During this time, the enslaved faced disease, malnutrition, and abuse. The lack of sanitation led to outbreaks of deadly diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, and measles. Many enslaved Africans did not survive the journey. Those who did often arrived in the Americas in a weakened and traumatized state. Despite the brutality, there were instances of resistance and defiance. Some enslaved Africans attempted to revolt on the ships.
Life for enslaved Africans in the Americas was brutal and dehumanizing. Upon arrival, they were often sold at auctions like livestock. Families were routinely separated, with members sold to different owners. The enslaved were forced to work long hours under harsh conditions, often facing physical punishment for any perceived disobedience or failure to meet work quotas. Plantations were the primary sites of enslavement. Enslaved people worked in fields growing crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The work was grueling and relentless. Overseers used whips and other forms of punishment to maintain control. Enslaved women faced additional abuse, including sexual exploitation by their owners and overseers. Despite the brutal conditions, enslaved Africans found ways to resist and maintain their humanity. They formed communities and preserved cultural traditions from their homelands. Music, dance, and religion played significant roles in these communities, providing a sense of identity and solidarity.
Section 5. Cultural resilience and impact. Despite the oppressive conditions, enslaved Africans demonstrated remarkable cultural resilience. They brought with them a rich heritage of traditions, languages, and beliefs. These cultural elements blended with those of other enslaved people and Indigenous and European populations, creating unique Creole cultures in the Americas. Music and dance were particularly significant. Enslaved Africans used these forms of expression to maintain a sense of community and identity. Drumming, singing, and dancing were not only means of cultural preservation but also acts of resistance. These traditions have had a lasting impact on the music and dance of the Americas, influencing genres such as jazz, blues, and samba. Religious practices also played a crucial role. Enslaved Africans adapted their spiritual beliefs to their new environments, creating syncretic religions that combined African, Christian, and Indigenous elements. Section 6. Resistance and revolts. Resistance to enslavement was a constant feature of the Atlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans resisted in numerous ways, from everyday acts of defiance to organised revolts. These acts of resistance were crucial in undermining the system of slavery and inspiring future movements for freedom and justice. Everyday resistance included work slowdowns, sabotage, and feigning illness. These acts disrupted the operations of plantations and demonstrated the enslaved people's refusal to accept their condition passively. Enslaved people also used more direct forms of resistance, such as running away. Escaped slaves often formed maroon communities in remote areas. where they lived free and sometimes launched attacks on plantations. Organised revolts were significant events in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. One of the most famous revolts was the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791.
Section 7. Abolition movements and key figures. The fight to end the Atlantic slave trade was long and arduous. Abolition movements emerged in Europe and the Americas, driven by a combination of moral, economic and political factors. Key figures in these movements played crucial roles in bringing an end to the trade and eventually slavery itself. In Britain, the abolition movement gained momentum in the late 18th century. Figures such as William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson campaigned tirelessly against the slave trade. Their efforts included gathering evidence of the trade's brutality, lobbying politicians, and raising public awareness. Their work culminated in the passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which banned the British slave trade. In the United States, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman played pivotal roles. Douglass, an escaped slave, used his powerful oratory and writings to advocate for the end of slavery.
Section 8. The Legacy of the Atlantic Slave Trade. The Atlantic slave trade left an indelible mark on history. Its legacy is evident in the widespread racism and inequality that persists today. The trade established a racial hierarchy that dehumanized people of African descent and justified their exploitation. These attitudes have had long-lasting effects on societies around the world. In the Americas, the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to face significant challenges. Systemic racism, economic disparities, and social exclusion are pervasive issues. The legacy of slavery is also evident in the cultural contributions of African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Latinos. Their resilience and cultural innovations have profoundly shaped the societies in which they live. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade also includes ongoing efforts to confront and address this dark chapter in history. Section 9. Ongoing issues of racism and inequality. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade continues to shape contemporary societies. Racism and inequality remain pervasive issues that affect the descendants of enslaved Africans. These issues are deeply rooted in the historical injustices of slavery and require ongoing efforts to address and rectify. Systemic racism manifests in various forms, including economic disparities, educational inequities, and social exclusion. People of African descent often face barriers to economic opportunities, leading to higher rates of poverty and unemployment. Educational systems frequently fail to provide equal opportunities, resulting in significant achievement gaps. Social exclusion and discrimination further exacerbate these challenges. Efforts to address these issues include policy reforms, community initiatives, and social movements. Policies aimed at promoting economic equality, such as affirmative action and reparations, seek to redress historical injustices.
Section 10. Educational and cultural remembrance. Education and cultural remembrance play vital roles in addressing the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. Understanding this history is crucial for fostering awareness and promoting reconciliation. Educational programs, museums, and cultural initiatives aim to honor the victims and educate future generations about this dark chapter in history. Museums and memorials dedicated to the history of slavery provide powerful spaces for reflection and education. They offer insights into the experiences of enslaved Africans and the impact of the slave trade on societies. These institutions play a crucial role in preserving historical memory and promoting understanding. Educational programs in schools and universities are also essential. Integrating the history of the Atlantic slave trade into curricula helps students understand its significance and its lasting impact. This education is vital in fostering empathy, awareness, and a commitment to social justice.
Section 11. Conclusion. Reflecting on a dark chapter in history. The Atlantic slave trade was a dark chapter in human history. It was a period marked by immense suffering, brutality, and dehumanization. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and subjected to unimaginable hardships. The legacy of this trade is still felt today in the form of systemic racism, economic inequality, and cultural resilience. Reflecting on this history is essential for understanding the present and shaping a better future. It requires acknowledging the profound injustices of the past and addressing their ongoing impact. By educating ourselves and others about the Atlantic slave trade, we can foster awareness, empathy, and a commitment to social justice. The resilience and resistance of enslaved Africans and their descendants are central to this story. Despite the brutality they faced, they preserved their cultures, fought for their freedom, and laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the struggle for equality.